The sun beat down on the cracked earth like a hammer on an anvil. Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked across his dying ranch. The cattle that once dotted his land now lay as white bones scattered across the desert floor. It was the summer of 1887, and the worst drought anyone could remember had gripped the Sonoran Desert with iron claws. Thomas had been in Arizona territory for 12 years now. He'd come west after losing his wife to fever back in Chicago, carrying nothing but grief and a stubborn Irish determination to start over. The land around Tucson had seemed promising then. Water ran in the creek beds, grass grew thick enough to feed cattle, and a man could make an honest living if he worked hard enough. But now the creek beds were nothing but cracked mud. The grass had turned to dust months ago. Thomas counted his remaining cattle each morning, and each morning there were fewer. Yesterday he'd lost another 3 head. At this rate, he'd have nothing left by October. He walked back toward his small adobe house, boots crunching on the dry earth. The well still had water, but barely enough for him to drink. He'd already sold his horse to buy grain that was gone now. His nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away, and the town of Tucson might as well have been on the moon for all the help it offered. That's when he saw the dust cloud. At first, Thomas thought it might be a dust devil. The desert threw them up often enough, but as the cloud grew closer, he could make out riders. His heart started beating faster. Apache raids had been common in these parts, though things had been quiet lately. He reached for the rifle that never left his side. But then he saw something that made him pause. One of the riders carried a white flag. Thomas had dealt with the Apache before. Not in battle, thank God, but in trade. When they came to his ranch, they usually wanted cattle or supplies. He'd always treated them fair, never cheating on weights or prices like some of the other ranchers did. Word traveled fast in the desert, and the Apache had come to trust him. The riders approached slowly. There were about a dozen of them, all mounted on sturdy desert horses. At their head rode a man Thomas recognized immediately. Chief Victorio was a legend in these parts. The Apache leader had fought the U.S. Army to a standstill more times than anyone could count. His face was weathered like old leather, marked with scars from countless battles, but his eyes were sharp as flint, missing nothing. Victorio raised his hand in greeting. "McKenna," he said in heavily accented English. "Chief," Thomas replied, lowering his rifle but not setting it aside. "What brings you to my ranch?" The Apache leader dismounted and walked closer. His warriors stayed on their horses, hands near their weapons but not threatening. "Yet. Your cattle are dying," Victorio said, looking around at the barren land. "Yes," Thomas admitted. "There was no point lying about something so obvious. Mine too. My people suffer. Children cry for water that is not there." Thomas nodded. He'd heard the Apache were having it as bad as everyone else. Maybe worse, since they couldn't just pack up and move to California like some of the white settlers were doing. Victorio studied Thomas for a long moment. "You are different from other white men. You trade fair. You do not lie or steal. You show respect." "I try to treat everyone right," Thomas said, wondering where this conversation was heading. "Good. Because I have offer for you." Victorio's expression grew serious. "In Dragoon Mountains there is hidden spring. Water flows strong even now, enough for many cattle, many people." Thomas felt his heart jump. Water. Real, flowing water. It could save his ranch, his life, everything he'd worked for. "What do you want for it?" This was where things got strange. Victorio was quiet for so long that Thomas began to wonder if the chief had changed his mind. Finally, the Apache leader spoke. "I have 3 daughters, all unmarried, all—" He paused, searching for the word. "Difficult." Thomas blinked. "I'm sorry?" "My daughters are warriors. They fight like men, think like men. They are tall, taller than most Apache men. They scare away every suitor who comes for them." Victorio's face showed a mix of pride and frustration. "They will die unmarried unless something changes." "Chief, I'm not sure what you're asking me." "You will marry them. All 3. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He stared at Victorio, sure he'd misunderstood. "Marry? All 3? "Yes. You take my daughters as wives, I give you water rights to Hidden Spring. Your cattle live, your ranch survives. My daughters have husband who will treat them with respect." Thomas's mind reeled. Marriage to 3 Apache women? He'd barely learned to live with one wife, God rest her soul. And these were warriors, women who fought in battles? The whole idea seemed impossible. "Chief, I appreciate the offer, but..." Look around, Victorio interrupted, gesturing at the dead landscape. Your choice is simple. Marry my daughters or watch everything you built turn to dust. Thomas looked out over his dying ranch. Every bone-white skull of a dead cow was a reminder of how desperate his situation had become. He had maybe 2 weeks of supplies left. After that, he'd have to abandon everything and head back east with nothing but the clothes on his back. But marriage? To 3 women he'd never met? Women from a completely different culture who apparently scared their own people?
What if they don't want to marry me?
He asked. Victorio's weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile. They do not want to marry anyone, but they will obey their father. Once. And after that? After that, you are on your own. Thomas felt sweat trickling down his back, and not just from the heat. This was insane. But the alternative was losing everything and starting over at 42 years old with nothing. How tall are we talking? He found himself asking. Ayana, the oldest, stands taller than you. Kachina and Ulji are almost as tall, all strong like men, skilled with weapons. Thomas was 6 feet tall himself, so these women would tower over most people. No wonder they intimidated potential suitors. They know English. Some. They learn fast. The silence stretched between them while Thomas wrestled with the decision. Around them, the desert heat shimmered like water that wasn't there. A buzzard circled overhead, probably eyeing his last few cattle. If I say yes, Thomas said slowly. When would this happen? Tomorrow. I bring daughters at sunrise. You agree now or I ride away and you never see me again. There it was. The moment that would either save his life or destroy it completely. Thomas looked out at his dying ranch one more time. Then he looked at Victorio, whose dark eyes revealed nothing. All right, he said finally. I agree. Victorio nodded once sharply. Good, you will not regret this, McKenna. My daughters are fierce, but they are honorable. Treat them well, and they will be loyal unto death. The chief mounted his horse and gathered his reins. Sunrise, he repeated. Then he and his warriors rode away, leaving Thomas alone with the biggest decision of his life already made. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept imagining what tomorrow would bring. 3 Apache women trained as warriors, taller than most men, with no desire to be married. It sounded like a recipe for disaster, but as he lay there listening to the desert wind, he thought about the alternative. Slow death by drought. Watching everything he'd built crumble to nothing. At least this way he had a chance, even if it was the strangest chance any man had ever been offered. Thomas woke before dawn, his stomach twisted in knots. He'd barely slept 3 hours, tossing and turning as he tried to imagine what the day would bring. Through his small window, he could see the first pale light creeping across the desert. Somewhere out there, 3 Apache women were riding toward his ranch to become his wives whether they wanted to or not. He splashed water on his face from the basin beside his bed, precious water he could barely afford to waste. His hand shook as he shaved with his old razor. What did a man wear to meet 3 warrior brides? He settled on his cleanest shirt and pants, though everything he owned was faded and patched from years of hard living. The coffee was just starting to boil when he heard them coming. No dust cloud this time, no sound of hoofbeats. They moved like ghosts across the desert floor. Thomas stepped outside and felt his breath catch in his throat. 3 figures stood near his barn, having appeared as silently as morning shadows. They wore traditional Apache dress, buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork and silver ornaments. But there was nothing delicate about them. These women stood like soldiers, backs straight, alert to everything around them, and they were indeed tall. Very tall. The one in the middle, who had to be Ayana, stood at least 6 inches taller than Thomas himself. Her black hair hung in 2 thick braids down her back, and her dark eyes studied him with the intensity of a hawk watching prey. Scars ran along both her arms, pale lines against her bronze skin that spoke of battles fought and survived. To her left stood another woman, nearly as tall, who Thomas guessed must be Kachina. She moved differently than her sister, every motion fluid and precise. Even standing still, she gave the impression she could vanish into thin air at any moment. Her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging every detail of the ranch, every possible hiding spot, every potential threat. The third sister, Ulji, was the youngest but still taller than most men Thomas had known. Unlike her sisters, who watched him with calculating calm, her dark eyes burned with barely controlled anger. Her hand rested casually near the knife at her belt, and Thomas had no doubt she knew how to use it. "Good morning," he said in English, then tried the Spanish greeting he knew. Buenos dias, none of them responded. They simply stared at him like they were sizing up an enemy before battle. Thomas cleared his throat and tried again. I'm Thomas. Thomas McKenna. Your father sent you here, still nothing. Ayanna tilted her head slightly, studying him from a different angle. Kachina continued her constant surveillance of the surroundings. Olgi's hand moved closer to her knife. Are you hungry? Thomas asked, making eating motions with his hands. Food? Water? That got a reaction, but not the one he expected. Ayanna stepped forward, and suddenly there was a blade in her hand. Thomas hadn't even seen her draw it. The knife appeared faster than his eye could follow, and the message was crystal clear. Stay back. Thomas raised his hands slowly, showing empty palms. I understand. You don't know me. You don't trust me. That's smart. He backed toward his house, moving carefully to avoid any sudden gestures that might be seen as threatening. I'll be inside if you need anything. As he reached his door, he heard Ulgi speak for the first time. She said something in Apache to her sisters, her voice sharp with what sounded like disgust. Whatever she said made Kachina's lips twitch in what might have been amusement. Thomas spent the morning trying to work while staying aware of his unusual guests. They had taken up positions around his barn that gave them clear views of all approaches to the ranch. It was a defensive setup that would have made any army sergeant proud. These women definitely knew what they were doing. Around noon, curiosity got the better of him. He walked toward the barn, carrying a plate of food and a jug of water. The sisters tracked his every movement, hands near their weapons, but they didn't try to stop him. He set the plate and jug on a wooden crate about 10 feet away from them, then backed off. It's just beans and cornbread, he called out, and water from my well. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Kachina glided forward with that unnaturally quiet step of hers. She examined the food carefully, smelling it, checking for anything suspicious. Finally, she nodded to her sisters. They ate in shifts, never allowing all three to be distracted at the same time. Even while eating, they remained alert, ready for trouble. Thomas found himself impressed despite the strangeness of the situation. These weren't just women who happened to know how to fight. These were professional warriors trained from childhood in survival and combat. The afternoon brought its first real test. Thomas was checking on his few remaining cattle when he heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the distinctive rattle of a diamondback. He turned slowly and saw the snake coiled near his feet, tail vibrating in warning, ready to strike. Thomas had been in the desert long enough to know better than to make sudden movements. Diamondback bites were usually fatal, especially when you were miles from help. He began backing away inch by careful inch, but the snake followed, apparently seeing him as a threat to whatever it was defending. The rattle grew more insistent. Thomas reached for his rifle, but it was slung across his back and would require movements the snake might interpret as aggressive. Sweat poured down his face as he tried to figure out how to get out of this without getting bitten. That's when Ulgi appeared. Thomas didn't see her coming. One moment he was alone with the snake. The next moment she was there, moving with liquid grace. Her hand flicked forward and a throwing knife buried itself in the diamondback's head with surgical precision. The snake died instantly, its rattle falling silent. Thomas stared at the dead snake, then at Ulgi. She retrieved her knife, cleaned it on the snake's body, and slipped it back into its sheath with practiced ease. Then she looked at Thomas for the first time since arriving. Why? She asked in heavily accented English. It was the first English word any of them had spoken to him. Thomas wasn't sure what she was asking, but he sensed this was important. Why what? He replied carefully. She gestured around the ranch at the barn where her sisters waited, at him. Why? Thomas thought he understood. She was asking why he had agreed to this arrangement, why he was treating them with respect instead of trying to force them into submission like many men might, why he continued working his failing ranch instead of just giving up. Because, he said slowly, I know what it's like to be somewhere you don't want to be. I know what it's like to lose everything you care about. Ulgi studied his face intently. Wife? She asked. Yes, she died. Fever. 3 years ago. Something shifted in Ulgi's expression. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Understanding, maybe, or at least recognition that they shared something in common. You sad? She observed. Yes. Very sad. For a long time. She nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the barn. But as she went, she said something that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. We all sad too. That evening, for the first time since their arrival, the three sisters allowed Thomas to approach their camp by the barn. They had built a small fire and were cooking something that smelled much better than his usual beans and cornbread. When he got closer, Ayanna spoke to him in broken English. "Sit," she said, patting the ground near the fire. It wasn't exactly a warm invitation, but it was progress. Thomas sat cross-legged as the sisters had, accepting the bowl of stew Kachina offered him. It was delicious, made with wild plants he didn't recognize and seasoned with herbs that made his simple cooking seem like sawdust by comparison. "This is very good," he said, and was rewarded with what might have been a smile from Kachina. As they ate, Thomas tried simple words in English and Spanish, listening as the sisters occasionally responded in their own language. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. But gradually he began to understand their situation better. They were here because their father had commanded it. But they were no happier about the arrangement than he was nervous about it. They had been warriors and scouts used to freedom and respect among their people. Now they were trapped in a bargain they had no part in making, married to a strange white man they didn't know or trust. As the fire died down, Ayanna spoke again. "Sleep where?" Thomas pointed toward his house. "I have a bed inside. You can have it." "I'll sleep in the barn." All three sisters exchanged glances. Then Ayanna shook her head. "We sleep here. You sleep house. Are you sure? It gets cold at night." Kachina said something in Apache that made her sisters laugh. The first genuine laughter Thomas had heard from them. Then she pointed at their blankets and gear. "We Apache," Ulji said with a slight smile. "Cold not problem." That night Thomas lay in his bed listening to the low murmur of the sisters talking by their dying fire. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was different now. Less angry, more thoughtful. Maybe, just maybe, this impossible situation might work out after all. Or maybe they were planning to kill him in his sleep. With these three, both options seemed equally possible. 3 weeks passed like a strange dream that Thomas couldn't wake up from. Every morning he expected to find the sisters gone, vanished back into the desert as silently as they had come. But every morning they were still there, maintaining their careful watch over his failing ranch. It was the oddest household Thomas could imagine. The three Apache women had established their own routines and territory around the barn, while Thomas continued his daily struggle to keep his ranch alive. They coexisted like cautious animals sharing a water hole, aware of each other, respectful of boundaries, but never quite relaxed. The sisters took turns sleeping, always keeping at least one person on watch. Thomas had never seen anything like their discipline. Even when they seemed to be resting, they remained alert to every sound, every movement, every change in the wind. It made him realize how careless he had become living alone in the desert. Communication remained a challenge. Thomas had picked up a few Apache words by listening carefully, while the sisters slowly added to their English vocabulary. Ulji proved to have the best ear for languages, often serving as translator when her sisters wanted to communicate something complex. But mostly they communicated through actions and necessity. When Thomas's last bull got sick and couldn't stand up, it was Kachina who appeared beside him with a collection of desert plants. She showed him how to brew them into a tea and pour it down the bull's throat. Thomas had no idea what the plants were, but the bull was on its feet within 2 days. When a pack of coyotes started circling his remaining cattle at night, Ayanna and Ulji took care of the problem without being asked. Thomas woke to find coyote tracks leading away from his ranch, and the predators never returned. He never learned what the sisters had done, but it had been effective. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in late August. Thomas was checking his well, hoping to find the water level hadn't dropped overnight when disaster struck. He was leaning over the well opening when the wooden cover gave way beneath his weight. Thomas fell 12 feet straight down, landing hard on the rocky bottom of the well. Pain shot through his left ankle as he tried to stand. When he put weight on it, agony flared up his leg. The ankle was definitely sprained, maybe broken, but the injury was the least of his problems. The well was too deep for him to climb out, and its smooth stone walls offered no handholds. He was trapped at the bottom of his own water source with no way to get out. "Help," he called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Somebody help me!" For several long minutes, nothing happened. Thomas began to panic. The sisters might not even know where he was. They could assume he had gone to town or was working somewhere else on the ranch. He could die down here while they waited for him to return. Then he heard voices above. The sisters were talking rapidly in Apache, their words bouncing around the well shaft. A moment later, Ayana's face appeared in the circle of sunlight above. "Thomas hurt?" She called down. "Yes, my ankle!" "I can't climb out." More rapid discussion above. Then a rope dropped down, followed by Kachina herself. Thomas had never seen anyone climb down a rope so smoothly. She moved like she was walking downstairs instead of rappelling into a stone pit. She knelt beside him and examined his ankle with surprisingly gentle hands. Her touch was clinical, professional, like she had treated many injuries before. "Not broken," she announced. "Bad sprain. Can you get me out of here?" Instead of answering, Kachina tied the rope around his waist with knots that looked complicated, but felt completely secure. She called something up to her sisters, and Thomas felt the rope go taut. What happened next amazed him. Ayana and Ulji hauled him up 12 feet of well shaft as easily as lifting a sack of grain. Their combined strength was remarkable. Within minutes, Thomas was lying on the ground beside his well, squinting in the bright sunlight. Ulji knelt beside him and began binding his ankle with strips of cloth and wooden splints. Her hands moved with the same professional competence as Kachina's had shown. These women clearly knew field medicine as well as they knew fighting. "Thank you," Thomas said, looking at each of them in turn. "You saved my life." That's when Ulji asked the question that changed everything between them. "Why you not try force us?" Thomas blinked, not sure he understood. "Force you to do what?" "Marriage things. Man things. Most white men would try force." The question caught Thomas off guard. It had honestly never occurred to him to force anything. These women were clearly capable of killing him in his sleep if they chose to. But more than that, forcing himself on unwilling women wasn't something he could even imagine doing. "Because that wouldn't be marriage," he said finally. "That would be something else." "Something wrong," Ulji translated for her sisters, sparking an animated discussion in Apache. Thomas caught a few words he recognized, but most of it was beyond his understanding. Finally, Ayana spoke in her careful English. "Your wife. Tell about her." Thomas felt the familiar ache in his chest that always came when he thought about Rebecca, but something about Ayana's serious expression made him want to answer honestly. Her name was Rebecca. She was small, delicate. "Nothing like—" He gestured helplessly, realizing how that sounded. "Nothing like us," Ulji finished with a wry smile. "I didn't mean— We know. We not delicate. We not small. Continue." So Thomas told them about Rebecca, how they had met at a church social in Chicago, how she could make him laugh even when everything went wrong, how she had insisted on coming west with him despite her family's objections, how she had died in his arms during a fever epidemic, leaving him with nothing but grief and a half-built ranch. When he finished, the three sisters were quiet for a long time. Finally, Kachina spoke in English, her words careful but clear. "We sorry for your loss. We understand. We all lose people too." That opened a floodgate Thomas hadn't expected. Over the next few days, as he recovered from his ankle injury, the sisters began to share their own stories. Not the details, those would come later, but the basic facts of their lives. Ayana had been married once, to a young warrior who died in a raid against Mexican soldiers. She had been 17 and pregnant but lost the baby from grief and stress. She never tried to marry again, choosing instead to become a scout and tracker for her father's band. Kachina had been engaged to marry when she was 18, but her intended husband was killed by American cavalry during a peaceful meeting. The betrayal had left her bitter toward all outsiders, Apache and white alike. She became a hunter and warrior, one of the few women allowed to ride with the men. Ulji's story was different. She had never wanted to marry anyone. From childhood, she had preferred learning to fight and hunt rather than traditional women's work. When suitors came calling, she challenged them to combat and won. Eventually, word spread and the suitors stopped coming. "We all broken in different ways," Ulji explained one evening as they sat around their campfire. "Father think maybe white man can fix what Apache men cannot." "I'm not trying to fix anyone," Thomas said. "I'm too broken myself." That made Ayana laugh, a sound Thomas was beginning to treasure. Maybe that's why it worked. Broken people understand each other. The conversation shifted to practical matters. Thomas's ankle was healing, but he couldn't do heavy work for another week. The sisters had taken over most of the ranch duties without being asked. and they were far more capable than he had expected. Ayanna had studied the ranch's water system and identified several places where improvements could be made. Her engineering skills were impressive, honed by years of helping her people find and manage water sources in the harsh desert. Kachina had been hunting, bringing back rabbits and desert birds that provided much better meals than Thomas's usual fare. She seemed to know every edible plant in the territory, and their food stores were actually increasing instead of dwindling. Ulji had been exploring the surrounding area, mapping out potential threats and resources. Her scouting skills were extraordinary. She could read tracks like other people read books, and she knew exactly what was happening for miles around the ranch. "You are all incredible at this," Thomas said one night, gesturing around the ranch. "You probably don't need me at all." "We need," Ayanna corrected him. "Ranch is yours. We just help, but why? You could leave any time you wanted. Your father isn't here to force you to stay." The three sisters exchanged looks. Finally, Ulji answered, "Where we go. Apache land's getting smaller every year. Reservation is prison. Other white settlements would not accept us here." She paused, searching for the right words. "Here we have purpose, work to do, respect, and water," Kachina added with a practical smile. Thomas laughed at that, and soon all four of them were laughing together. It was the first time since the sisters arrived that the atmosphere felt truly relaxed. That night, as Thomas lay in his bed listening to the familiar sound of the sisters' quiet conversation by their fire, he realized something had fundamentally changed. They weren't prisoners anymore, any of them. They were becoming something else, something none of them had expected. They were becoming a family. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, but Thomas wasn't worried. He knew Ayanna, Kachina, and Ulji were on watch. Nothing would threaten his ranch while they were there. For the first time since Rebecca's death, Thomas fell asleep feeling truly safe. The morning of September 15th started like any other, but Thomas felt something different in the air. The sisters had been more animated than usual during their breakfast conversation, speaking rapidly in Apache with occasional glances in his direction. When he tried to ask what they were discussing, they just smiled mysteriously and continued their work. Thomas had grown used to their independent ways over the past 6 weeks. The arrangement that had started as a desperate bargain had evolved into something resembling a partnership. The sisters ran their own activities while contributing to the ranch's survival in ways Thomas was still discovering. His ankle had healed completely, thanks to Kachina's knowledge of desert medicine. The ranch's food situation had improved dramatically due to her hunting skills, and Ulji's ability to find edible plants. Most impressively, Ayanna had spent the last 2 weeks designing an irrigation system that could potentially transform his dying land into productive farmland. But they still hadn't seen the promised water source in the Dragoon Mountains. Chief Victorio had mentioned it during their original meeting, but there had been no sign of the hidden spring. Thomas had begun to wonder if it actually existed, or if the whole thing had been an elaborate bluff to get his agreement to the marriage arrangement. That question was answered when Thomas looked up from repairing a fence post to see a familiar dust cloud approaching from the east. His stomach tightened as he recognized the riders. Chief Victorio was returning, and he wasn't alone. A dozen Apache warriors accompanied him, riding in the same formation Thomas remembered from their first meeting. The sisters had spotted the approaching party even before Thomas did. They stood together near the barn, hands near their weapons but not obviously threatening. Their body language was formal, respectful, but Thomas could sense the tension in their posture. Victorio dismounted and approached with the same measured dignity he had shown before. His dark eyes took in the scene carefully, the improved condition of the ranch, the obvious partnership between his daughters and the white rancher, the subtle defensive positions the sisters had taken. "McKenna," he said with a slight nod. "Chief Victorio," Thomas replied. "Welcome back to my ranch. Your ranch does not look like it is dying anymore, it was true. The place looked better than it had in months, though still far from thriving. The remaining cattle were healthier, the water situation was more carefully managed, and there was an overall sense of order that had been missing before." Victorio's attention shifted to his daughters. He spoke to them in Apache, his tone carrying the authority of both a father and a tribal leader. Ayanna responded respectfully but firmly, her words punctuated by gestures toward Thomas and the ranch improvements. Kachina added her own comments, while Ulji remained characteristically direct in her responses. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Thomas understanding only scattered words. But he could follow the general flow. Victoria was asking about their treatment, their decision to stay, and their relationship with him. The sisters were explaining their choices and defending their actions. Finally, Victoria turned back to Thomas. My daughters tell interesting story. They say you honor agreement but do not force them into marriage bed. They say you work alongside them as equals. They say you share food and water freely even when you have little. That's all true, Thomas said carefully. They also say you have not seen promised water source. Thomas felt his face flush slightly. No, Chief, I haven't. I've been wondering if it really exists. Something that might have been amusement flickered in Victoria's eyes. It exists. My daughters know where it is. They have been testing you, McKenna, testing whether you are man of honor or man who takes what he wants by force. Thomas looked at the three sisters, who were now watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Testing me how? Ayana stepped forward. Hidden Spring is half-day ride from here. We've been there 3 times while you heal from ankle injury. We bring back extra water, study the land, plan irrigation system. You've been to the spring? Why didn't you tell me? Because, Ulji said with a slight smile, we need to know if you're trustworthy. If you demand immediate access to water or if you patient. If you treat us as property to give you things or as people to work with you. Kachina nodded in agreement. Most men would demand spring location immediately after ankle heal. Would threaten or try force us to reveal location. You never ask. Thomas felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. I figured you'd show me when you were ready. Pushing wouldn't help anyone. Victoria's weathered face broke into what was definitely a smile now. You see? This is why I choose you for my daughters. You understand patience. You understand respect. The Apache chief gestured to his warriors who began unpacking bundles from their horses. Today we go to spring, all of us. You will see what your patience has earned. The ride to the Dragoon Mountains took most of the morning. Thomas rode his only remaining horse while the sisters had somehow acquired mounts of their own, probably through trades with other Apache bands. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed into the foothills, following paths that Thomas would never have found on his own. Finally, they stopped at what appeared to be a solid rock wall. Thomas looked around in confusion, seeing nothing that resembled a spring or water source. Then Ayana dismounted and led the group around a massive boulder, revealing a narrow canyon entrance that had been completely hidden from view. The canyon widened as they followed it deeper into the mountains. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Thomas could hear the sound he'd been dreaming about for months. Running water. Lots of it. They emerged into a circular valley hidden in the heart of the mountains. At its center, a spring bubbled up from underground sources, creating a clear pool that overflowed into a stream running toward the desert below. The valley was green with grass and filled with trees, a hidden oasis in the middle of the harsh landscape. My God, Thomas whispered, staring at more water than he'd seen in 2 years. Apache have known this place for generations, Victoria explained. We use it when drought is bad, but we do not camp here permanent. Too hidden, too hard to defend if enemies find it. Ayana walked to the edge of the pool and knelt beside the water. Flow rate is steady even in worse drought. Underground source comes from deep aquifer. Stream follows natural path toward your ranch. Only needs help to reach your land. Thomas began to understand the scope of what she was proposing. An irrigation channel from this valley to his ranch would provide water for hundreds of cattle, not to mention crops and other development. This would be an enormous project, he said, looking at the distance they had traveled. Yes, Kachina agreed, but possible. We study the land, the elevation changes, the soil types. Channel would follow existing dry creek beds most of way. Hard work, but not impossible. Ulji pointed toward several Apache families who were camped near the spring. Other bands come here when water desperate. Your father's people, cousin clans, refugees from reservation, all need water. Thomas began to see the larger picture. This wasn't just about saving his ranch. This was about creating a water source that could support a much larger community. How many people are we talking about? He asked. Depends, Victoria said. Some Apache want to try living alongside white settlers instead of on reservation. Some Mexican families look for new places to farm. Even some white settlers who treat native people fair might be welcome. The magnitude of the idea hit Thomas like a physical blow. They weren't just talking about irrigation. They were talking about founding a completely new kind of community, one where Apache, Mexican, and white families could live and work together. That's never been done before, he said slowly. Many things never been done before, Ayanna replied, until someone do them first time. Thomas spent the rest of the day walking around the hidden valley, trying to absorb everything he was seeing and hearing. The spring was even better than Victorio had described, a permanent, reliable water source that could support significant development. The Apache families camping there were clearly desperate refugees from the increasingly harsh reservation system, and the three sisters had apparently been planning this transformation for weeks without saying a word to him. As evening approached and they prepared to ride back to the ranch, Victorio pulled Thomas aside for a private conversation. "My daughters tell me you still treat them as guests instead of wives," the chief said bluntly. Thomas felt his face redden. "I didn't want to pressure them into anything they weren't ready for. And now, after 6 weeks of living together, working together, trusting each other with lives," Thomas looked across the camp to where the three sisters were packing their gear with efficient coordination. Ayanna caught his eye and smiled. Not the cautious, guarded expression she'd worn for the first weeks, but something warmer and more genuine. "Now," Thomas said quietly, "I think we're becoming something none of us expected when this started." Victorio nodded approvingly. "Good, because tomorrow real work begins. Building irrigation system will take many people, many months. Community that grows around water source will need leaders who understand cooperation instead of domination." As they rode back toward the ranch under a sky brilliant with stars, Thomas found himself riding alongside Ayan. By October, Thomas's ranch looked nothing like the dying spread he'd been ready to abandon just 3 months earlier. What had started as a desperate bargain between one man and 3 Apache women had grown into something unprecedented in the Arizona territory, a community where different cultures worked side by side toward common goals. The transformation had happened gradually, almost without Thomas noticing the scope of what they were building. It started with the irrigation project. Ayanna's engineering skills proved even more impressive than anyone had realized. She designed a channel system that used gravity and natural slope to bring water from the hidden spring to the ranch, but her plans included branches that could serve multiple family plots along the way. Word of the project spread through networks Thomas hadn't known existed. Apache families fleeing the harsh conditions at San Carlos Reservation began appearing, asking if there was work available. Mexican vaqueros, displaced by political upheaval south of the border, heard about a place where skilled horsemen were welcome regardless of their accent. Even a few white settlers, tired of the constant conflict between cultures, showed up hoping to find a different way to live in the desert. Kachina had emerged as the community's unofficial coordinator for food and supplies. Her hunting skills fed not just Thomas's household, but dozens of people working on various projects. More importantly, she had established a network of traders who brought goods from Tucson, Mexico, and Apache bands throughout the territory. The woman who had once been too fierce to attract a husband was now managing complex business relationships with quiet competence. Ulji had become something Thomas never could have imagined: a teacher. Her gift for languages made her invaluable as families from different backgrounds tried to communicate and work together. She held informal classes each evening, teaching English to Apache children while learning Spanish from Mexican families, and picking up specialized terms from various trades. Her sharp intelligence and natural authority made her a bridge between groups that might otherwise have remained suspicious of each other. The most surprising development was how naturally romance had begun to bloom in this unlikely setting. Thomas found himself drawn to Ayanna in ways that went far beyond their original arranged marriage. Working together on the irrigation project, planning the community's growth, sharing quiet conversations in the evenings, he was falling in love with her mind as much as anything else. But he wasn't the only one finding unexpected connections. Kachina had surprised everyone by developing a relationship with Carlos Martinez, a quiet Mexican craftsman who specialized in leatherworking and silversmithing. The fierce Apache warrior and the gentle artisan seemed like an impossible match, but Thomas often saw them working together in comfortable silence, their very different skills complementing each other perfectly. Most shocking of all, Ulji, who had supposedly driven away every Apache suitor, had fallen hard for Nalnish, a young warrior from her father's band who had come to help with construction. The man was nearly as tall as she was, and possessed the same fierce independence that had made Ulji unmarriageable by traditional standards. They argued constantly, competed in everything from marksmanship to horse racing, and were obviously completely devoted to each other. The community had grown to include nearly 60 people by autumn, living in a collection of adobe houses, traditional Apache wickiups, and Mexican-style courtyards scattered around the expanded ranch. Water flowed through carefully constructed channels to irrigate vegetable gardens, small grain fields, and pastures where cattle and horses grazed side by side. Most remarkably, it all seemed to work. Conflicts arose, of course. Different groups had different ideas about everything from child rearing to property rights. But somehow they always managed to find solutions through discussion and compromise rather than violence or domination. Thomas credited the three sisters with making this possible. Their unique combination of skills, cultural knowledge, and hard-earned wisdom had created a foundation that could support such an unusual experiment. But he also recognized that all the residents had chosen to be there, which made a tremendous difference in their willingness to cooperate. The real test came in November, when territorial officials finally noticed what was happening. Thomas was working with Ayana on plans to expand the irrigation system when a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. This time it wasn't Apache riders or new families looking for a place to settle. The approaching party included uniformed cavalry soldiers and men in suits who could only be government officials. "Trouble coming," Ulji announced, jogging up from her usual scouting position. "How much trouble?" Thomas asked. Dozen soldiers, 3 officials, 1 very angry-looking man in expensive clothes. Ayana calmly rolled up the engineering drawings they'd been studying. "Time to see if our community's strong enough to survive outside pressure." Word spread quickly through the settlement. Within minutes, the various family groups had taken positions that weren't obviously defensive, but would become so quickly if needed. Apache men seemed to fade into the landscape while remaining close enough to respond to threats. Mexican vaqueros casually positioned themselves near the horse corral where weapons were stored. Even the children disappeared, spirited away to safe locations by their mothers. The official party rode up to Thomas's original house, where he waited with the 3 sisters and several other community leaders. The lead official was a thin man with pale skin already burning in the desert sun. His expensive Eastern clothes were completely impractical for Arizona territory, which told Thomas everything he needed to know about the man's experience with frontier life. "Are you Thomas McKenna?" the official demanded without bothering with introductions. "I am. This is my ranch. I'm Territorial Inspector Harrison Webb, and I'm here to investigate reports of an illegal Apache encampment on your property." Thomas felt Ayana tense beside him, but her expression remained calm. "These aren't prisoners or refugees," Thomas said carefully. "They're neighbors and business partners." Webb's pale eyes narrowed as he took in the obviously prosperous community around them. "Mr. McKenna, you cannot simply decide to establish unauthorized settlements in United States territory. All Apache residents are required to live on designated reservations under federal supervision." "And Mexican citizens?" Ayana asked in perfect English, surprising Webb with her fluency. "What? You say Apache must live on reservations. What about Mexican families? What about white settlers? What law requires them to live in specific places?" Webb's face reddened. "That's completely different. We're talking about American citizens working together to build productive community," Kachina interrupted, her English heavily accented but completely clear. "What law forbids this?" The inspector looked flustered. He had clearly expected to find a simple case of unauthorized Apache settlement that could be easily resolved by force. Instead, he was facing articulate women who understood the legal issues better than he did. "The point is," Webb said, trying to regain control of the conversation, "this community represents a security risk. Apache warriors living outside reservation oversight, weapons caches, unauthorized construction. The whole situation is irregular." Thomas stepped forward. "Inspector Webb, I'd like to invite you and your men to stay for dinner. See what we've actually built here before you make any decisions." "That's not necessary." "Actually, it is," said a new voice from behind Webb's party. Everyone turned to see a man in clerical clothing riding up to the group. Thomas recognized him immediately. Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who served Mexican and Apache communities throughout the territory. The padre was well known for his fairness and his ability to diffuse tense situations. "Father Santos," Thomas said with relief, "what brings you here? I heard there might be some misunderstanding about the nature of your community." The priest replied with a slight smile. "I thought I might help clarify things." Webb looked suspicious. "And you are?" "Father Miguel Santos. I've been serving communities throughout southern Arizona for 15 years. I've visited this settlement several times over the past 2 months. Visited for what purpose? To perform weddings, baptisms, and other sacraments for families here who request them. This is a legitimate community of hardworking people, Inspector. They're not hiding anything or threatening anyone." The priest's presence changed the entire dynamic. Webb couldn't simply dismiss a respected clergy member the way he might ignore Apache voices or Mexican protests. Father Santos had credibility with territorial authorities, and his calm testimony carried weight. What followed was the most tense dinner Thomas had ever experienced. Webb and his officials sat stiffly at tables set up in the community's central area, watching suspiciously as Apache, Mexican, and white families served food and made polite conversation. The soldiers remained mounted but accepted water and simple meals. Thomas watched Webb's expression change as the evening progressed. The inspector had clearly expected to find a lawless frontier settlement full of dangerous characters. Instead, he saw children playing together regardless of their backgrounds, families sharing food and resources, and obviously successful farming and ranching operations. Spring came early to the desert community in 1888, bringing with it the sweet scent of desert wildflowers and the sound of children's laughter echoing across irrigation channels that now sparkled with mountain water. But it also brought the biggest challenge the settlement had faced since its founding. Thomas was teaching young Miguel Martinez how to repair water gates when he spotted the dust cloud that meant visitors. His stomach immediately tightened. Over the past 6 months, he had learned to read the signs of different types of approaching parties, and this one looked ominous. The cloud was too large for traders or new families seeking to join the community. It was too organized for bandits or raiders. This had the look of official business, and serious official business at that. "Ulji," he called toward the schoolhouse where she was conducting the morning language lessons. "We have company coming. Looks like government officials and plenty of them." The Apache woman appeared instantly, her trained eyes scanning the horizon. After a moment, her expression grew grim. "More than officials. I count at least 30 soldiers. This not inspection visit." Word spread through the community with the speed that only came from months of practice. Within minutes, the settlement had transformed itself. Children vanished into houses with their mothers. Men took up positions that appeared casual but provided clear fields of fire. Weapons remained out of sight but within easy reach. To casual observers, it would look like a normal day at a prosperous ranch community. To anyone with military training, the defensive preparations would be obvious. Ayana emerged from the workshop where she had been designing improved plows, her hands still dusty from working with metal and wood. "How many total?" 40, maybe more, Thomas replied. "This isn't about permits or inspections. Someone powerful wants us gone." The 3 sisters exchanged glances, communicating in that wordless way they had developed over months of working together. Finally, Ayana nodded to her sisters and turned to Thomas. "We knew this day would come. Community too successful to ignore, too different to accept. Question is whether we fight or negotiate." "We try talking first," Thomas said firmly, "but we prepare for other possibilities." The approaching party was indeed impressive and intimidating. At its head rode a man in an expensive suit, whose pale complexion and soft hands marked him as someone who spent more time in offices than on horseback. Behind him came territorial officials Thomas recognized, including the nervous Inspector Webb from their previous encounter. But the real message was delivered by the 30 cavalry soldiers riding in perfect formation, their uniforms spotless and their weapons prominently displayed. The man in the expensive suit rode directly up to where Thomas waited with the 3 sisters and several other community leaders. When he dismounted, Thomas noticed his boots were new and clearly uncomfortable. Definitely not a man used to frontier life. "I'm Governor Louis Wolfley of Arizona Territory," the man announced in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "And I am here to resolve the illegal situation that has developed on this property." Thomas felt his heart sink. The territorial governor himself, This was far worse than he had feared. "Governor Wolfley," Thomas replied as respectfully as he could manage. "Welcome to our community. I'm Thomas McKenna, and these are—" "I know who they are," Wolfley interrupted, his cold eyes fixing on the three sisters. "The Apache women whose father arranged this irregular situation. Well, gentlemen, the arrangement is now void. All Apache residents are to be relocated to the San Carlos Reservation immediately. All unauthorized structures are to be demolished, and this property is to return to legitimate ranching use." The words fell like hammer blows. Thomas felt Ayanna stiffen beside him, but her expression remained carefully neutral. Around the settlement, he could sense people freezing in place, waiting to see how this confrontation would develop. "Governor," Ayanna said in her clear, educated English, "may I ask what law requires American citizens to live in specific locations based on their ancestry?" Wolfley's face flushed red. "You are not American citizens. You are Apache Indians under federal guardianship, and you will return to your designated reservation." "Actually," said a new voice from behind Wolfley's party, "that's not entirely accurate." Everyone turned to see Father Miguel Santos riding up, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him came a small man in spectacles whose modest appearance contrasted sharply with the official pomp of the governor's entourage. "Father Santos," Thomas said with relief. "Governor, this is Father Miguel Santos, who serves communities throughout the territory." "I know who he is," Wolfley snapped. "What I want to know is why he's interfering in territorial business." "Because," said the small man in spectacles, dismounting carefully, "territorial business is my business. I'm Judge Harrison Fletcher of the Territorial Supreme Court." The governor's confident expression wavered slightly. "Judge Fletcher, I wasn't expecting—" "No, I imagine you weren't. Father Santos brought some interesting legal questions to my attention, so I decided to see this community for myself before any irreversible actions were taken." Thomas felt a surge of hope. A territorial judge carried more authority than even the governor in certain legal matters, and Father Santos had clearly done some careful preparation for this confrontation. Judge Fletcher walked slowly through the settlement, examining the irrigation system, the well-built houses, the obvious prosperity of the residents. The three sisters accompanied him, answering his questions in perfect English and demonstrating detailed knowledge of territorial law. "Quite impressive," the judge said finally. "Now, Governor Wolfley, perhaps you could explain the precise legal basis for your order to dismantle this community." "The Apache residents are living outside their designated reservation," Wolfley replied, though he sounded less certain than before. "And the Mexican families?" "Well, that's different." "Different how? And what about Mr. McKenna and the other white settlers? Are they also required to live in designated locations?" Ayanna stepped forward with a leather portfolio. "Your Honor, we have prepared documents showing legal ownership of this land, proper water rights, and compliance with all territorial settlement laws. We also have testimonials from traders, officials, and neighboring ranchers about our community's positive contributions to the territory." Judge Fletcher examined the documents carefully, while Governor Wolfley waited with obvious impatience. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the judge read through legal papers, surveys, and sworn statements. Finally, Judge Fletcher looked up. "Governor, these documents appear to be in perfect order. The land was legally purchased, water rights were properly filed, and the settlement was established according to territorial law. I see no legal basis for forced relocation or demolition, but the security risk—" "What security risk?" Kachina interrupted. "We trade peacefully with neighbors. We help travelers who need assistance. We report criminal activity to authorities. How are we security risk?" Inspector Webb, who had remained quiet throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Governor, I spent 3 days here last year investigating security concerns. I found no evidence of illegal weapons, no signs of hostile activity, no threats to territorial safety. My report recommended monitoring but not intervention." Wolfley's face grew redder. "The point is that this mixing of races and cultures is unnatural. It sets a dangerous precedent. What if other Apache bands decide to leave their reservations? What if this spreads? What if it does?" Judge Fletcher asked mildly. "This community pays taxes, produces food and goods, maintains peaceful relations with neighbors, and follows territorial law. Isn't that exactly what we want from all settlements in Arizona territory?" The debate continued for another hour. with Wolfley becoming increasingly frustrated as his legal and practical arguments fell apart. The three sisters presented their case with calm professionalism, backed by Father Santos's moral authority and Judge Fletcher's legal expertise. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Wolfley's own soldiers, a sergeant named Patrick O'Malley, approached the group during a pause in the discussion. "Begging your pardon, Governor," he said in a thick Irish accent, "but my horse has thrown a shoe, and one of the Apache fellows has offered to fix it. Would that be acceptable?" Wolfley waved dismissively, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Fine. Just get it done quickly." What happened next was pure theater, though Thomas suspected it was carefully planned by someone, probably Ulji, who had a gift for managing people and situations. As Sergeant O'Malley led his horse toward Nalnish's smithy, half the settlement seemed to find reasons to be nearby. Children played games that happened to display their multilingual education. Women worked on crafts that showcased the community's artistic talents. Men demonstrated agricultural techniques that highlighted their impressive crop yields. Most importantly, people talked to the soldiers. Not in the fearful, subservient way Wolfley might have expected, but as neighbors sharing stories and comparing experiences. Thomas watched several soldiers accept cool drinks and simple foods, relaxing visibly as they realized they were among friends rather than enemies. The moment that changed everything came when young Carlos Martinez, Kachina's stepson, approached Governor Wolfley himself. December 15, 1888, dawned crisp and clear across the desert community that had grown from Thomas McKenna's failing ranch into something unprecedented in the American Southwest. For weeks, families had been preparing for what everyone agreed would be the most important celebration in the settlement's short but remarkable history. 3 weddings in one day. 3 couples whose relationships had grown naturally from the unique circumstances that brought their community together, and 3 ceremonies that would prove to the outside world that their experiment in multicultural cooperation wasn't just surviving, it was flourishing in ways that defied every expert prediction. Thomas woke before sunrise, his stomach churning with nervousness that had nothing to do with the extensive preparations required for the day's events. After 18 months of living alongside Ayana, working with her, learning from her, and gradually falling in love with her brilliant mind and fierce determination, today they would officially become husband and wife. But it wasn't the ceremony itself that made him nervous. It was the knowledge that over 200 people would be watching, including territorial officials, Apache chiefs from across the region, Mexican dignitaries, and even a few federal representatives who had traveled from as far away as Santa Fe. Word of the triple wedding had spread throughout the Southwest, drawing visitors who were curious, supportive, skeptical, or openly hostile to what the community represented. Ayana had been awake for hours already, directing the complex logistics required to feed and house such a large gathering, while maintaining the security that their mixed population always required. Thomas found her in the community's central kitchen, coordinating with a dozen women who were preparing traditional foods from 3 different cultures. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, stealing a quiet moment with her amid the organized chaos. She turned from supervising the preparation of traditional Apache wedding bread, flour dusting her hands and a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Ready to marry you?" "Yes." "Ready for all the attention and politics that come with it?" "We'll see." The morning's first challenge came when Chief Victorio arrived with a larger party than expected. The Apache leader brought not just his own band, but representatives from 6 other tribes who wanted to witness whether his daughter's unusual marriages would prove successful or disastrous. "Father looks nervous," Ulji observed as she watched the Apache delegation set up their camp near the settlement's eastern edge. "He should be," Kachina replied, adjusting the silver ornaments in her hair. "Today proves whether his crazy bargain 18 months ago was stroke of genius or terrible mistake." The Mexican contingent created their own stir when they arrived mid-morning. Carlos Martinez, Kachina's quiet craftsman fiancé, had more family connections than anyone realized. His uncle turned out to be Don Roberto Herrera, one of the wealthiest ranchers in Sonora, who brought his own entourage of relatives and business associates. But the biggest surprise came when Judge Fletcher arrived with a familiar figure, Governor Lewis Wolfley himself, looking considerably less hostile than during his previous visit. Behind them rode a small group of officials whose presence made Thomas's heart race with both hope and anxiety. "McKenna," Governor Wolfley said, dismounting near Thomas's original adobe house, "I told you I'd be watching your community's progress." "Yes, sir, you did." "Well, I've been watching, and what I've seen has been educational." The governor's expression was unreadable. "Judge Fletcher suggested I might learn something by observing your community's social structures in action." Thomas wasn't sure if that was good news or bad news, but there was no time to worry about it. The ceremonies were scheduled to begin at noon, and the final preparations were consuming all his attention. The wedding site itself represented everything the community had accomplished. The ceremonies would take place in a natural amphitheater formed by desert rocks, but enhanced with carefully planned landscaping and irrigation that had turned the harsh landscape into something approaching a garden. Apache, Mexican, and American traditions had been woven together into decorations that honored all three cultures without favoring any one over the others. At exactly noon, the ceremonies began with a precision that impressed even the military officials in attendance. First came the Apache rituals, led by a respected medicine man who had traveled from the White Mountain Reservation specifically for these weddings. Ayanna and Thomas stood together as burning sage smoke swirled around them, participating in blessing ceremonies that had been part of Apache culture for generations. The Apache ceremony was followed immediately by a Catholic Mass conducted by Father Miguel Santos, who had become the community's unofficial spiritual leader for families of all backgrounds, who wanted formal religious recognition of their unions. Kachina and Carlos knelt together as the priest blessed their marriage in Spanish and English, surrounded by the rich symbolism of Mexican Catholic tradition. Finally came what everyone agreed was the most unusual ceremony, Ulji and Nalnish's wedding, which combined Apache customs with innovations they had created specifically for their unique situation. As two Apache warriors who had found love through competition and mutual respect, they exchanged vows that emphasized partnership and equality rather than traditional gender roles. But the moment that truly changed everything came during the wedding feast that followed the ceremonies. Governor Wolfley, who had observed the entire day with careful attention, stood to address the assembled crowd. Thomas felt his stomach drop, expecting either condemnation or condescending praise that would somehow diminish what they had accomplished. Instead, the territorial governor delivered a speech that no one saw coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfley began, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering, "I came here today expecting to witness an interesting cultural curiosity. What I have seen instead is a demonstration of American values at their finest." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Apache chiefs exchanged glances with Mexican dignitaries, while territorial officials shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This community," Wolfley continued, "represents everything our nation claims to stand for. People from different backgrounds working together toward common goals. Prosperity built through cooperation rather than conquest. Success achieved through merit rather than privilege. Children being raised to see diversity as strength rather than threat." Thomas looked at Ayanna, whose expression was carefully neutral despite what had to be amazement at the governor's words. "But most importantly," Wolfley said, his voice gaining strength, "this community has proven that peace and prosperity are possible even in regions that have known primarily conflict and hardship. The economic success of this settlement, the lack of crime or violence, the educational achievements of the children. All of this has been accomplished without federal subsidies, without military oversight, without the bureaucratic structures that have failed so dramatically in other attempts at Indian policy." The governor paused, looking directly at Chief Victorio before continuing. "Therefore, I am pleased to announce that the Arizona Territory will officially recognize this settlement as the incorporated town of Hermana Valley, with full legal status and territorial representation." The announcement hit the gathering like a thunderclap. Incorporated town status meant legal protection from arbitrary interference. It meant the right to elect their own officials and manage their own affairs. It meant permanent legitimacy for their experimental community. But Wolfley wasn't finished with his surprises. "Furthermore," he said, "I am recommending to federal authorities that Hermana Valley serve as a model for similar communities throughout the Southwest. Instead of the failed reservation system, we should be encouraging the kind of voluntary integration and mutual prosperity that has been achieved here." The celebration that followed the governor's announcement lasted 3 days and became legendary throughout the territory. Apache drums mixed with Mexican guitars and Irish fiddles. Traditional foods from 3 cultures were served side by side. Children who spoke multiple languages played games that combined rules from different traditions. Most importantly, the celebration attracted visitors from throughout the Southwest who returned home with stories about a place where the impossible had become routine. Within months, similar communities began forming in New Mexico, Colorado, and even California, often led by people who had visited Hermana Valley and decided to try the model in their own regions. The economic impact was immediate and significant. The triple wedding celebration had showcased the community's agricultural products, crafts, and livestock to buyers from across the territory. Orders poured in for everything from Kachina's silver jewelry to the community's innovative irrigation equipment designed by Ayana. But the most important change was in how people saw the community itself. What had started as Chief Victorio's desperate bargain to find husbands for his unmarriageable daughters had become a symbol of hope for people throughout the Southwest who were tired of conflict and division. Political implications became clear within weeks of the wedding celebration. Territorial newspapers that had once mocked the Amazon brides. 7 years had passed since that desperate morning when Chief Victorio rode to Thomas McKenna's dying ranch with an impossible proposal. By 1895, Hermana Valley bore no resemblance to the struggling settlement that had emerged from that bargain. The town now sprawled across several square miles of irrigated desert, home to over 300 residents whose prosperity had become legendary throughout the Southwest. Thomas stood on the porch of the substantial adobe house he now shared with Ayana and their 2 children, watching the morning bustle of a community that had exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. Their 4-year-old son Roberto ran between the garden rows with his younger sister Elena, both children switching effortlessly between English, Spanish, and Apache as they played games that would have been impossible to imagine just a few years earlier. The most remarkable transformation belonged to Ayana herself. The tall Apache woman who had once stood silently in his barn, hand near her knife and suspicion in her eyes, was now the elected mayor of Hermana Valley and the first Apache woman to hold territorial office. Her engineering innovations had revolutionized agriculture throughout the Southwest, and her diplomatic skills had prevented dozens of potential conflicts between different cultural groups. This morning, she was preparing for what might be her most important challenge yet, a meeting with federal officials who were considering adopting the Hermana Valley model for Indian policy throughout the Western Territories. Success could mean the end of the reservation system and the beginning of genuine integration based on mutual respect rather than forced assimilation. "Are you nervous about the meeting?" Thomas asked as Ayana reviewed her presentation materials one final time. "Always nervous before important meetings," she replied with a smile that had become warm and open over the years, but also excited. This could change lives for thousands of families. The federal interest in Hermana Valley hadn't emerged overnight. It was the result of 7 years of consistent success that had gradually convinced even skeptical bureaucrats that their approach worked better than traditional Indian policy. The community's economic prosperity was undeniable. Their agricultural output per acre exceeded that of most farming communities. Their crime rate was virtually non-existent, and their educational system produced children who were prepared for success in the modern American economy while maintaining pride in their cultural heritage. Kachina's transformation had been equally dramatic. The fierce warrior who had once been too intimidating for Apache suitors was now one of the territory's most successful businesswomen. Her trading network stretched from Mexico City to Denver, and her silver jewelry was sought after by wealthy customers as far away as New York. She and Carlos had built a thriving workshop, where Apache artisans worked alongside Mexican craftsmen to create goods that combined the best of both traditions. Most remarkably, Kachina had become a mother to 4 children, Carlos's son from his previous marriage, 2 children of their own, and an Apache orphan they had adopted after a reservation outbreak of disease. Her fierce protectiveness had found a perfect outlet in raising children who would never have to choose between their cultural identity and their economic opportunities. Ulji's impact had perhaps been the most far-reaching of all. Her school had attracted attention from educators throughout the country who were amazed by her students' achievements. Children who spoke 3 languages fluently, who understood mathematics and science, who could navigate between different cultural contexts with ease. They represented a new generation of Americans who saw diversity as normal and cooperation as natural. But Ulji's influence extended beyond education. She had become the community's unofficial ambassador, traveling throughout the Southwest to speak at conferences and meetings where people wanted to understand how Hermana Valley had achieved such remarkable success. Her marriage to Nalnish had produced 3 children who were being raised to see themselves as bridges between cultures rather than representatives of any single tradition. The morning meeting began with the arrival of an impressive federal delegation, including officials from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, representatives from the War Department, and even a special envoy from President Cleveland's administration. Thomas watched from his office as the officials toured the community, their expressions shifting from skepticism to amazement as they observed the obvious prosperity and harmony of the diverse population. The formal presentation took place in the community's meeting hall, a substantial building that had been constructed to accommodate the large gatherings that had become routine as Hermana Valley's fame spread. Ayanna stood before maps and charts that documented 7 years of economic growth, population increase, and social stability. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of successful leadership, "what you see in Hermana Valley is not an experiment or an accident. It is the natural result of treating people as individuals rather than as representatives of racial categories." The federal officials listened as Ayanna explained the community's governance structure, which combined elements from Apache consensus building, Mexican municipal traditions, and American democratic principles. They examined economic data that showed consistent growth and diversification. They interviewed residents from all backgrounds, finding universal satisfaction with their community and fierce loyalty to its principles. The breakthrough came when one of the officials, a Bureau of Indian Affairs administrator named James Morrison, asked about the reservation system. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, "your community's success is impressive, but how do we know it can be replicated elsewhere? The reservation system was created to manage complex problems that can't be solved simply by wishful thinking about cooperation." Ayanna's response was calm, but pointed. "Mr. Morrison, with respect, the reservation system has failed by every measure that matters. It has created poverty instead of prosperity, dependence instead of self-sufficiency, and resentment instead of loyalty to American institutions. What complex problems has it actually solved?" The official looked uncomfortable. "The reservations provide security, education, medical care, but at what cost?" Ulji interrupted, stepping forward with statistics she had prepared. "Infant mortality on reservations is triple the national average. Educational achievement is far below standards. Economic development is virtually non-existent. Meanwhile, Apache families here in Hermana Valley enjoy health, education, and prosperity equal to or better than most American communities." The debate continued for hours, but gradually the federal officials began to understand what they were seeing. Hermana Valley hadn't succeeded despite its cultural diversity. It had succeeded because of it. Different traditions brought different strengths that combined to create something more resilient and prosperous than any single culture could achieve alone. The meeting's climax came when Chief Victorio himself arrived, now an elderly man but still carrying the dignity that had made him legendary throughout the Southwest. He had ridden from his reservation in New Mexico specifically to address the federal officials. 7 years ago, the old chief said in careful English, "I made bargain with this man McKenna. I give him my daughters. He give them chance for different life than what reservation offered. Today you see results of that bargain." He gestured toward Ayanna, Kachina, and Ulji, who stood together as they had that first morning in Thomas's barn, but now as confident leaders rather than reluctant prisoners of circumstance. "My daughters not just survive, they thrive. They raise children who are proud of Apache heritage but also successful in American world. They build community that brings prosperity to all people, not just Apache people. This is what federal government should want from Indian policy." The impact of Victorio's words was immediate and obvious. Here was one of the most respected Apache leaders in the Southwest, endorsing integration based on equality, rather than assimilation based on cultural destruction. That evening, as the federal officials prepared detailed reports that would influence Indian policy for generations, The community celebrated with a feast that had become traditional for important occasions. Apache drums mixed with Mexican guitars and American fiddles, while children who embodied the community's multicultural future played games that drew from all their various traditions. Thomas found himself standing with Judge Fletcher, who had become a regular visitor and strong supporter of the community over the years. "You know what you've accomplished here, don't you?" the judge asked, watching families from different backgrounds sharing food and laughter. "We've built a good place to live and raise children," Thomas replied modestly. "You've done much more than that. You've proven that the American ideal actually works when people are given genuine opportunities to succeed. Every child playing in this plaza tonight will grow up believing that cooperation is normal and prejudice is strange. That's going to change the world." As the celebration continued into the night, Thomas reflected on the long journey from that desperate drought morning to this moment of triumph and hope. Ayana found him sitting quietly at the edge of the festivities, their children asleep in her arms. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling beside him.